New York, October 29, 1929. The ticker tape is running 4 hours behind. 11,000 trades are executing simultaneously on a floor designed for 3,000. Outside the exchange, a crowd has gathered on Broad Street, not rioters, not protesters. People standing quietly, trying to understand what is happening to their savings. Inside, $40 billion of paper wealth is evaporating in real time. Somewhere in that crowd, or in offices connected to it by telephone lines burning with sell orders, a small number of people are doing something that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from everything else happening. They are buying, not because they are brave, not because they are reckless, because they had spent the previous months building positions that paid when prices fell, and now the prices were falling with a completeness that exceeded even their most pessimistic calculations. The 1929 crash is remembered as a catastrophe. It was, for the majority of the people who lived through it, exactly that. $40 billion gone in a week. Unemployment that would reach 25%. Banks that would fail in their thousands. A depression that would reshape the political economy of the entire Western world. But catastrophes are not events that destroy value absolutely. They are events that transfer value from those positioned on the wrong side of a change to those positioned on the right side of it. The question that economic history has asked with insufficient precision is not who survived the crash. It is who profited from it. Who were the specific people and institutions that, when $40 billion of paper wealth was destroyed in October 1929, captured a portion of that destruction as gain? The answer divides into 4 categories. Each category reveals something about how wealth transfers during catastrophic market events that no textbook on the 1929 crash has ever assembled into a unified account. The famous names. The ones that history has recorded, if incompletely. Jesse Livermore made approximately $100 million shorting the market in 1929. In 2024 dollars, that is roughly $1.8 billion. He did it through a mechanism that was legal, documented, and structurally brilliant. He built short positions in the months before the crash, betting that prices would fall, and collected when they did. Livermore's story is well known in financial circles. What is less well known is the specific mechanism through which his profit was generated and who precisely paid for it. Every dollar Livermore made shorting the market was a dollar transferred from the people who were long the market. The short seller's profit is not extracted from thin air. It is extracted from the people who continued to hold positions that declined in value, from the small investors who had bought on margin and could not sell fast enough, from the banks that had extended credit against stock collateral that was losing value faster than the margin calls could be processed. Livermore's $100 million was not created by the crash. It was redistributed by it. This distinction matters for understanding the full picture of who profited from 1929. Because Livermore was visible, the people who paid were not visible. They were the aggregate of hundreds of thousands of margin accounts, retirement savings, bank deposits, and commercial loans that the crash destroyed as it transferred value to those who had positioned themselves to receive it. Joseph Kennedy's profit from 1929 is even more instructive than Livermore's, not because it was larger, but because the mechanism was different and more durable. Kennedy did not primarily profit from shorting the market. He profited from what he did after the crash, from the systematic acquisition of distressed assets at collapse prices, and from the use of his political connections to position himself advantageously in the regulatory architecture that followed the crash. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The legislation that created the regulatory framework for American financial markets was shaped, in significant part, by people whose professional interests were served by specific regulatory choices. Kennedy was appointed the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission by Franklin Roosevelt. He shaped the regulatory environment that would govern American financial markets for the next 80 years. This is the fuller picture of crash profit. Not just the trade that paid when prices fell, but the positioning that shaped what came after the acquisition of assets, the influence over reconstruction, the leverage over the new institutional architecture that a crash makes necessary. John D. Rockefeller's position during the crash has been less documented than Kennedy's or Livermore's, and that absence of documentation is itself instructive. Rockefeller's wealth was already so enormous by 1929 that the crash, while reducing his paper wealth significantly, left him with resources that most Americans could not conceptualize. What he did during and after the crash, the systematic acquisition of distressed assets through intermediaries who left minimal paper trails, represents the category of crash profit that economic history records least completely. The wealthy accumulate during crashes not primarily through spectacular short positions. They accumulate through the patient, undocumented, intermediary-mediated purchase of assets that desperate sellers are liquidating at prices that reflect maximum fear rather than fundamental value. Rockefeller's family office was doing this in 1929 and 1930. The documentation is fragmentary. The scale is difficult to establish with precision. The pattern is consistent with everything the historical record shows about how substantial wealth accumulates during periods of distress. The prepositioned are the visible layer of crash profit. They are the names that appear in the history books. They are also in terms of total value captured, not the largest layer. This is the category that economic history finds most uncomfortable to discuss with precision, not because the evidence is absent, because the evidence requires acknowledging something about the relationship between institutional design and institutional self-interest that disrupts the comfortable narrative of the crash as pure catastrophe. The banks and financial institutions that were most deeply involved in creating the conditions for the 1929 crash were not uniformly destroyed by it. Some were. Many of the smaller banks that had extended credit against stock collateral failed catastrophically. Nearly 10,000 American banks closed between 1929 and 1933, destroying the savings of millions of ordinary depositors. But the largest financial institutions, the ones with sufficient scale, sufficient political connection, and sufficient advance knowledge of their own exposure, navigated the crash in ways that preserved their institutional position, even as the clients they had served were destroyed. National City Bank, the institution that would eventually become Citibank, had spent the 1920s aggressively selling investment securities to retail customers. Its chairman, Charles Mitchell, had been one of the most visible cheerleaders for the bull market. His institution had sold stocks to ordinary Americans that it knew internally were of questionable value. Mitchell was eventually prosecuted for tax evasion. National City Bank survived. The retail customers who had bought the securities National City sold them did not uniformly survive. Many lost their savings entirely. The institutional survival of National City Bank, while its retail clients were destroyed, is not a coincidence or an accident. It reflects something structural about how large financial institutions relate to the assets they distribute. The institution is the intermediary. It earns fees distributing assets to clients, not primarily from holding those assets itself. When the assets decline in value, the intermediary has already collected its fees. The client holds the loss. This is not specific to the 1929 crash. It is the permanent structure of financial intermediation. But the 1929 crash revealed it with unusual clarity because the scale of the loss was so large and the asymmetry between institutional survival and client destruction was so visible. J.P. Morgan, by 1929, the institution, not the man who had died in 1913, occupied a position during the crash that economic historians have examined with particular attention. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the first day of the crash, a consortium of major banks convened at the Morgan offices and agreed to purchase stocks in a coordinated effort to stabilize prices. This coordinated purchase, led by Morgan partner Thomas Lamont, temporarily stabilized prices on October 24th. By the following Monday and Tuesday, the stabilization had failed completely. Prices collapsed further than they had on Thursday, but here is what the historical record shows about the Morgan Consortium's coordinated purchase that is almost never discussed in standard accounts. The stocks the consortium purchased on October 24 were purchased at above-market prices. The consortium was deliberately buying higher than the prevailing market to signal confidence. Within days, those stocks had fallen significantly further. The consortium had taken losses on the stabilization purchase. Those losses, however, were distributed across the consortium. They were manageable losses for institutions of the size involved. And the coordinated purchase had accomplished something that benefited the consortium members in ways that were worth more than the losses they absorbed. It had provided an orderly window during which the consortium members could unwind their own more exposed positions. Ron Chernow's History of the House of Morgan documents this period with careful precision. The Morgan partners were not reckless speculators. They had managed their own exposure more conservatively than the clients they served. The stabilization operation of October 24th was, simultaneously, a genuine effort to prevent panic and a mechanism that served the institutional interests of the participants. This is the structure of institutional crash profit, not the dramatic short position, not the heroic contrarian purchase. The quiet management of institutional exposure in ways that place the concentrated losses on the clients rather than the institution, combined with the performance of stabilization that earns reputational and political credit even when the stabilization fails. These are the people who profited most completely from the 1929 crash and about whom economic history knows the least. They were not famous. They did not give interviews. They did not write memoirs. They operated through intermediaries, through trusts, through acquisition vehicles that were designed to be difficult to trace. They were the buyers on the other side of every desperate sale, the purchasers of foreclosed farmland, distressed commercial real estate, bankrupt businesses, and liquidated estates that the crash produced in quantities that had never before been available at any price. The forensic economic work that has been done on wealth distribution in the 1930s, work by economists including Emanuel Sayers and Gabriel Zucman on long-run inequality, shows something that is difficult to explain through any mechanism other than large-scale distressed asset accumulation during the crash and depression years. The concentration of wealth at the very top of the American wealth distribution reached its modern peak in the early 1930s, not before the crash, but after it. The crash destroyed paper wealth across the distribution, but the years immediately following the crash saw a reconcentration of real asset ownership, land, productive businesses, commercial property that the available data can only partially explain through income. The reconcentration was driven by purchase. Assets were being bought during the Depression years at prices that reflected maximum distress, at prices that made no sense relative to the eventual productive capacity of the underlying assets. The buyers were the people with liquidity at exactly the moment when liquidity was most valuable and most scarce. Who had liquidity in 1930, 1931, 1932? Not the wage earners who had lost their jobs, not the farmers whose crop prices had collapsed, not the small business owners whose customers had stopped buying, not the depositors whose banks had failed. The people who had liquidity in the Depression were those who had been liquid before the crash, whose wealth was already in forms that the crash could not destroy, or who had converted into liquid positions before October 1929. Some of them are partially documented. William Randolph Hearst's financial difficulties during the Depression are well known. He was not among the hidden accumulators, having overextended himself in the preceding boom. Andrew Mellon's position is better documented and more instructive. As Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents, Mellon had both advanced knowledge of policy responses to the crash and the personal wealth to act on that knowledge. His systematic acquisition of art, real estate and financial assets during the Depression years is partially documented. His art collection, which he eventually donated to found the National Gallery of Art, was assembled substantially during the Depression at collapse prices. But Mellon is the visible edge of a much larger and much less documented phenomenon. The hidden accumulators operated in every market and every asset class that the crash had distressed. They bought farmland from bankrupt farmers through county auction processes that were attended by small numbers of buyers who, in some documented cases, coordinated to keep prices artificially low. They purchased commercial real estate through acquisition vehicles that were intentionally structured to obscure the identity of the ultimate buyer. They acquired equity positions in distressed businesses through intermediaries who appeared to be independent investors. John Kenneth Galbraith noted in his account of the Depression that one of its most striking features was the rapidity with which certain forms of productive capacity changed hands, not destroyed, but transferred from those who had owned it before the crash to those who acquired it during. The transfer was so large and so systematic that it could not be explained by normal market processes. It required the existence of a class of buyers with both the financial capacity and the organizational sophistication to identify and acquire distressed assets at scale. Those buyers were the hidden accumulators. Their descendants are among the largest landholders and business owners in America today. Their acquisitions during the Depression established family fortunes that persist into the present. Their names are not in the standard accounts of the 1929 crash because they were deliberately absent from the public record of the period. The total value they captured from the crash and depression cannot be precisely quantified. It was, by any reasonable estimate, larger than what the famous names the Livermores and Kennedys and Rockefellers captured through their more visible mechanisms. The most consequential profiteers from any crash are always the ones nobody is watching. Washington, D.C., 1933. Franklin Roosevelt's administration is assembling the legislative architecture of the New Deal. The Banking Act of 1933, the Securities Act of 1933, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The regulatory framework that will govern American financial markets for the next 8 decades is being written in rooms where certain people are present and certain people are not. The people who are present matter enormously, because the regulatory architecture being built is not neutral. Every specific provision of every specific piece of legislation advantages some parties and disadvantages others. Every definition, every exemption, every enforcement mechanism encodes specific choices about who operates under which rules. The people in those rooms are writing the rules that will govern their own industries, and they are writing them in ways that serve their institutional interests, not through corruption, not through explicit quid pro quo, but through the simple mechanism of expertise. The people who understand financial markets well enough to write financial regulation are, almost by definition, people whose careers have been built within financial markets. Their understanding of what the rules should be is shaped by what the rules would mean for the institutions they have spent their careers in. Carter Glass, the Virginia senator who co-authored the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking, was not a corrupt man. He was a sincere reformer who believed the separation would prevent the conflicts of interest that had contributed to the crash. The specific form of the separation he designed, however, preserved the profitability of the largest institutions while eliminating competition from smaller ones. The Glass-Steagall Act, which is remembered as a reform measure that constrained Wall Street was also a piece of legislation that significantly increased the market power of the large commercial banks by prohibiting their competitors, the investment banks, from competing for the same deposit base. This is narrative control as an economic mechanism. The framing of the regulatory response to the crash as pure reform as constraint on the powerful in service of the powerless obscures the degree to which the regulatory response was shaped by the interests of the most sophisticated players in the financial system. The most sophisticated players in any crisis are those who understand both the financial mechanics of what went wrong and the political mechanics of what will be written in response. The intersection of financial sophistication and political access defines the group that captures the largest share of the regulatory dividend. Joseph Kennedy's role illustrates this with uncomfortable clarity. He was appointed first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission by Roosevelt, a choice that shocked many reformers, who viewed Kennedy as a symbol of exactly the speculative excesses the SEC was designed to regulate. Roosevelt's reported response to the critics was that it took a thief to catch a thief. The more accurate analysis is that it took someone who understood the financial system from the inside to write regulations that the financial system could actually be governed by. Kennedy's tenure as SEC chairman was substantively effective. He established regulatory frameworks that functioned, and those regulatory frameworks functioned in part because they were designed by someone who understood where the lines needed to be drawn from the perspective of someone who had operated on both sides of them. The conflict between Kennedy's personal financial interests and his regulatory role was real. It was also irresolvable because the expertise required to write effective financial regulation is the expertise accumulated by financial practitioners, not financial theorists. The narrative controllers captured value from the 1929 crash not primarily through financial instruments. They captured it through the more durable mechanism of shaping the institutional environment that would govern American financial markets for the decades that followed. The rules they wrote determined which institutions would thrive and which would not, which activities would be permitted and which would be prohibited, which competitive advantages would be embedded in law and which would be eliminated. That regulatory capture the shaping of the rules by those best positioned to benefit from specific rule designs is the most enduring and most valuable form of crash profit. It outlasts the Depression. It outlasts the careers of the individuals who exercised it. It structures the competitive landscape for decades. Here is what 4 categories of crash profit reveal about the 1929 catastrophe that no standard account assembles in one place. The crash did not destroy $40 billion of wealth. It transferred it from the long investors to the short sellers, from the depositors of failed banks to the institutions that survived, from the desperate sellers of distressed assets to the patient buyers with liquidity, from the regulated to the regulators who shaped the regulatory architecture. The transfers were not equal. The prepositioned captured a visible but relatively small portion of the total value transferred. Jesse Livermore's $100 million was a rounding error in the context of the total wealth redistribution that the Depression produced. The institutional architects captured more through the mechanism of placing concentrated losses on clients while preserving institutional capital, and through the reputational and political credit earned through the performance of stabilization. The hidden accumulators captured the most through the patient, undocumented, intermediary-mediated purchase of real productive assets at collapse prices. The farmland, the commercial real estate, the distressed businesses that changed hands during the Depression years at prices reflecting maximum fear rather than fundamental value. The narrative controllers captured something different from wealth. They captured the architecture, the rules that would determine who could do what in American financial markets for the next 8 decades. Rules that encoded specific competitive advantages, specific exemptions, specific enforcement mechanisms that served the interests of those sophisticated enough to shape them. Together, these four categories constitute a complete account of the crash's beneficiaries. An account that is more uncomfortable than the standard version, which frames the crash as pure catastrophe and the New Deal as pure reform, because it requires acknowledging that catastrophic events are not simply destructive. They are redistributive. The redistribution is not random. It follows consistent structural patterns that repeat across every major financial crisis in the historical record. The people who profit from crashes are not lucky. They are positioned. They are positioned through mechanisms that require years of deliberate construction, the short position built over months, the legal architecture designed before the crash, the liquidity preserved through conservative management. When everyone else was extending, the political relationships cultivated across decades. The most important question the 1929 crash poses for the present is not who profited then. It is whether the four categories of crash profit apply today. Short. Positions can still be built against overvalued assets. Legal architecture can still be constructed to protect wealth from concentrated institutional failure. Liquidity can still be preserved when everyone else is extending. Political relationships can still be cultivated before the regulatory response to the next crisis is written. The mechanisms are unchanged. The specific instruments are more sophisticated. The underlying logic is identical to what it was in 1929. Every crash produces the same four categories of beneficiary. The crash itself is what changes. The structure of who profits from it has not changed in a century. And here is the thought that the historical record of 1929's beneficiaries leaves with anyone willing to sit with it fully. The $40 billion that appeared to vanish in October 1929 did not vanish. It redistributed to the short sellers who had positioned for the fall, to the institutions that had managed their own exposure while distributing the risk to clients, to the patient buyers who purchased the assets that desperate sellers could not afford to keep, to the sophisticated players who shaped the rules that would determine American financial markets for the decades that followed. The money was always there. It simply moved. It moved from the unprepared to the prepared, from the reactive to the proactive, from those who understood the market as a place to participate to those who understood it as a mechanism that, in extremis, transfers value with mathematical indifference to the fairness of the transfer. The crash of 1929 was not the story of $40 billion disappearing. It was the story of $40 billion finding new owners. History has documented the disaster. It has been considerably less precise about documenting the beneficiaries. Subscribe. This channel performs economic autopsies on history's greatest financial events, examining not just what happened, but who benefited, how they did it, and what. The mechanism reveals about every financial crisis since. The crash of 1929 is over. The mechanisms it revealed are not.